Hi guys, welcome back. Now last week I mentioned that I was going to be ramping up the number of sort of modern themed videos that I was going to do for a while because there had been so many requests and so much interest in sort of, I don't know, the 20th century and kind of onward. And this week I've definitely chosen something that I think qualifies quite well. This is something, in fact, from the end of the 20th century, and it is this guy. This is a long-range reconnaissance patrol soldier from Vietnam, a U.S. unit. So he's one of their sort of elite forces from that period. This particular sculpt is by Baker Company, and don't worry, there'll be a link in the description box if you're interested in getting him. He is definitely available. And I've already gone ahead and applied a base coat and painted the skin in my usual fashion. Now, the thing that probably these long-range reconnaissance patrol guys were known for in terms of their uniform was this sort of, I guess it would be called tigerstripe pattern camouflage that they often wore, which was unique, and from, I suppose from our painter's perspective, it's a little bit tricky because it's got sort of long horizontal dark stripes sort of on a green field, but then there's lots of sort of white detailing, lots of fine white lines running around there too, which can be tricky to paint. So I'm going to be looking at how exactly you can do that because, you know, it's, you know, it can feel overwhelming, these camouflage patterns, especially the more modern ones. Now, there was a lot of variety in the tiger stripe that this sort of commando unit wore, because it was apparently not standard US issue. It was just something that the elite units sort of favored and would buy and would sort of get their own custom uniforms made out of it. So you'll see a lot of variation. That's why if you look at pictures, you'll see that you'll see even within one picture guys wearing slightly different patterns because it was just not standardized. There's different varieties. Some are only green and black with sort of a cream, and then there's others that also have browns mixed in there, or multiple shades of green or brown. So it's all over the place. And in fact, if you don't want to deal with it at all, that's possible too, because there's also guys who are just kind of wearing the standard issue kind of US camouflage, more, you know, the more bland kind, which is really just, you know, the green and brown sort of splotches, sort of classic camo that we think about. So, and that's definitely easier to paint, so if you don't want to do this, it is possible to kind of get around it. So that's what we're going to be covering in this video, mostly is how to paint the tiger stripe camo pattern, and his equipment is also kind of a little bit more green khaki, or sort of greenish, you know, fabric, so we'll be looking at that a little bit again too. And so why don't we just go ahead and get started, because this is going to be probably a lot of work, and you know, we need all the time we can get. Okay, so we're going to start out now by base coating all of the areas we want to have camouflage, which are his pants, his jacket, and his headscarf. Now, the best way to handle a complex pattern like this is to try to break it down into very simple basic elements that we can tackle. And so first we need to figure out the field color, and then we'll move on to figuring out what needs to go on top of it. And I decided that basically the easiest way to handle this pattern is to use the green here and apply that everywhere, and then build up the pattern sort of on top of that. And as I've mentioned, there's more complex versions of this pattern out there as well, but I think at this scale we want to choose the simplest version that we can, because as we've seen before, excessive detail at 28mm is really not your friend, and you need to try to always get to the essence of whatever pattern you're trying to recreate. And the base color here is German camouflage bright green with a fair amount of reflective green mixed into it to darken it up, because the German camouflage bright green on its own is just a bit too bright, and I think it's just too electric, and I didn't want to use that here, so I've darkened it down quite a bit in order to get a nice base coat for this figure. Because of how complicated and detailed this pattern is, there's not really much point in spending a lot of time shading and highlighting the base color of the clothing, because it's all just going to get lost. But we are going to do a little bit of preliminary work just to make it a little bit easier. And what I'm doing here is applying a nice heavy wash to the whole uniform area. And I've made this by mixing Corellia green shade and Agrex earth shade from Citadel. And I'm just going to put that everywhere. And I think there actually is a wash color that you could use from Citadel that would do this all in one step. But because I don't have it, I have just decided to mix my own using green and brown washes that I do have. Once the wash has finished drying completely, I'm going to continue doing a little bit more basic highlighting, and I'm using here more of the reflective green and the German camouflage bright green. In this case, there's a lot more of the German camouflage bright green in here, and I thinned it down a fair amount so that's nice and transparent, and I'm going to just apply that over top. It's not really dramatically different from the base color, it's just kind of subtle, but it'll let me kind of highlight and, you know, get rid of any really extra dark areas that I don't want. And I'm just going to, you know, go over the figure a couple of times, building up some layers of this in preparation for applying my pattern. And this is really all I'm going to be doing almost in terms of highlighting on this figure. And I'll be showing you more in a little bit how we can still get some sort of tonal differences without, you know, resorting to normal highlighting techniques. So now we can start working on the pattern proper, and obviously I do recommend that you have a look at a picture of the tiger stripe camouflage pattern, because that's going to be useful for you regardless of what I can show in this video. The first element we're going to be doing are the sort of the tiger stripes, for lack of a better word, which are kind of a dark gray black color basically, and I've made them here by mixing black with a little bit of German camouflage black brown, because I want to warm the color up a little bit. And we're basically just creating horizontal lines here. They should sort of thin out at either end, so they should be kind of thicker in the middle and more or less thinner at either end. And sometimes they also split and fork off. They're not always just lines. Sometimes they sort of divide off into other lines. They're not consistent. If you don't quite see what I mean, you can also look at the coat of a real tiger, and you'll see that this happens on their fur, that they have these kind of lines that split off, and it'll make maybe a little bit more sense. So just go ahead and apply those lines, and make sure you keep your paint nice and thin, because obviously doing this well is going to be difficult if you have thick, gloppy paint. Painting the tiger stripe shouldn't have been too difficult, but now we're getting into the real tricky part of this pattern, because it's on a green field with those black stripes, but then sort of in between you've got a lot of very, very fine little white, well, not really white, in this case it's more sort of an off-white color, lines that just go every which way, up, down, backwards, all different lengths, just kind of squiggly and teeny tiny in relation to the black stripes. The color that I'm going to be applying them with here is going to be Boneyard Light from Foundry, and when you're doing this, you want to make sure your paint is really quite thin. Be careful, if it gets too thin, it'll get transparent, and that's not what you want, because then you don't want to have to go back over and apply these lines multiple times. But it does need to flow very well, and while you're working, you may need to keep adding water periodically to the paint if it starts to get too thick and you can't make the lines the way you want. So what you can see I'm doing here is I'm applying many teeny tiny little ones, and you want to, this is where having a really fine pointed brush is critical. I always use a number 1 brush for pretty much everything, and this is no exception, but I have a very fine quality number 1 brush. This is a Winsor & Newton Series 7, and it's almost new, which means the tip is still very good and comes to a very, very fine point at the end. If you don't have access to this kind of brush, you may need to scale down with your brush a little bit. You may want to try a size 0 or even a 00, depending on, you know, how you like to work. But the bottom line is here, you need to just keep paint on your brush, and you need to really only be touching with the tippiest tip of the brush and trying to just make very tiny, fine squiggles. And one characteristic of this pattern is that the white line should never cross over the black tiger stripes. The white sort of mixes into kind of a stringy muddle almost with the green field, but it never crosses or intersects the tiger stripes. They should always be just clean and straight and never have any white on them. The white can sort of run along the edges of them. You can kind of choose to line them with white, but you should never ever bring white over the top. So just you want to just go very carefully, very slowly, keep your paint thin, and just gradually fill in all of the sort of the green areas with these little sort of tiny little white crisscross kind of scribbly strokes until you've managed to cover the entire uniform in this fashion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with such a complicated pattern, it's going to be easier if you keep highlighting to a minimum, because, I mean, realistically, how are you going to highlight all those little white lines? However, I am going to do just a little bit of highlighting on the tiger stripes themselves, and I've just taken here some German gray from Vallejo and mixed just a little bit of that boneyard light into it just to get it a slightly lighter shade. And I'm going to now be applying that to the tiger stripes that I feel are not sort of in the shadows. In other words, putting it on the ones where, you know, the light would be hitting, just to get a little, you know, extra highlight and depth of color there. And because these are fairly large areas, it's not too difficult to do this. So given the fact that highlighting is not really a viable option with a pattern like this, we have to find some other way to get sort of depth and contrast in our pattern. And as I have shown you before on other such complex camo patterns, the best way to do this is going to be with washes and through shading. And once again, I've created here a custom color that I'm going to be using for the shading. I have taken a mix of the Corellia green shade once again, the Agrex earth shade, and now also some Nuln oil, all from Citadel. So I have sort of a black, browny green color, and I'm going to be applying that in all of the recess areas in order to sort of start building up color from in a sort of reverse fashion. So it's going to go in all the obvious places, like sort of in creases and seams and sort of dark shadow areas underneath his backpack and between his arms, places where you'd expect it to be. But you can apply it, like you can see here, at places too, like on his headscarf as well. If you apply it thinly and you blend it out and you don't put on a very thick layer, you can still do some very subtle shading this way. And I'll be using this as well on his pants. For example, under his knees. I want his knees to appear to be quite bright and shiny because light would be hitting there, but right underneath should be a little bit darker so that you get a good contrast between that sort of light area. So I'll be applying a thin coat sort of gently on the front of his calf there and blending that out. And that'll form a really nice contrast with the lighter color on his knees. And this also will help restore shadows in areas that got sort of painted over by those white streaky marks that we made a little bit ago. This is a great way to fix them. And because washes are so transparent, you're going to have to go back several times over and over and build up layers and levels of color and get depth. But that's actually what makes this so brilliant, because you can be quite subtle about this if you want to. It takes a little time, because you have to go over it several times, but you're going to get really nice, subtle results that they don't really feel unnatural, and you can use the same wash to apply, both very dark, to make very dark areas and also somewhat lighter areas on the figure. I'm also going to take some Agrex Earth shade, and I'm going to apply it by itself very sparingly in some areas, to get some different color into the uniform, because I want, this uniform, you expect it to be a little dirty, certain areas to get dirty, to get worn, to get faded, and one great way to do that is to take some brown and sort of sparingly add it into areas where you'd like that to happen. So places like around under his knees, around the bottoms of his pants, his elbows, places you'd expect to see wear and dirt and grime, and this is a nice way to add just a little bit more complexity to the pattern, a little bit more interest, and get some other tones and kind of colors into the figure here. I'm then going to move on to his equipment, and it's all basically a certain kind of shade of green khaki. But because he's carrying so much stuff, he's got so many pouches and boxes and stuff, and a big backpack that's all stuffed on his back, we don't want to do that all in just one color, because that would get a little boring and repetitive. So I'm going to be using two kind of distinct shades for painting his equipment here. The first one is going to be going on to his backpack and, the straps holding it on, and also his belt. And I have made this by taking the reflective green again from Vallejo and mixing some Russian uniform World War II into that. That's more of a kind of a browny green color, and that's going to form the base for these particular areas. Once you finish the base coat on those areas, you can then also go ahead and apply a very generous wash of Agrax Earthshade, which will help bring out all of the details on these particular pieces of equipment. My first highlight then on these areas of equipment is going to be that Russian uniform World War II with a bit of the reflective green, a little of the also of the German camouflage bright green mixed into it. We should be trying to get definitely a lighter color here than what we had before, but I found that the Russian uniform color was just a bit too brown, which is why I felt it was necessary to mix in some extra greens. And you're going to want to put this pretty much everywhere except down in the recess areas that we got so nice and dark with the wash in the last step. I've then made another highlight layer, which was created by mixing some Boneyard medium from Foundry into that color that I already created. So it's just going to get a little lighter, a little more yellow, and just definitely a bit brighter. And I'm going to apply that on areas where I want, more light, and especially along the edges of all of the sort of pieces of fabric. I'm going to apply it there the most intensely and strongly, maybe even putting on a couple layers on the straps and those sorts of things. On the more sort of larger areas of the backpack, you can see I apply it and then sort of blend it out, so it's fairly thin and transparent, but still gives a little extra brightness to the equipment there. I decided that I wanted the remainder of his equipment to appear a little bit more brown. So that basically includes all of his pouches and bottles and things that he's wearing around his waist. And I'm going to start out by base coating those regions using some more of the Russian uniform World War II as my base color. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to add a heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade everywhere, just as I did with the equipment from my last step. To highlight the more brownish tone equipment pouches, I'm going to start out first with the khaki from Vallejo, and I'm going to apply this pretty generously to pretty much everywhere except all of the little seams and lines and stuff that you can see on these pieces of equipment. And there are actually quite a few of them, and if you want these to look good, you need to take the time and make sure that you don't paint over all these little sort of details that are sculpted here, because you've got that nice dark wash down in those recesses, and you should try and work with that and use that. So don't put your khaki color in those locations. Then I'm going to do some very careful edge highlighting using the Boneyard medium from Foundry again, and I'm really applying that along the edge of the pouches and bags and at the seams, and on the back a little bit on the water bottles. I am applying it on bigger areas, but then I'm applying it fairly thin and I'm blending it out substantially because I don't want it to get too bright, and I want to focus most of these high highlights really on the edges and seams. And now for the boots. I'm going to start out by applying a black base coat all over the entire surface area. Next, I'm going to move on to a highlight, which I'm going to make by mixing a little bit of black, the German camouflage black brown once again, and some German gray together. And this should still be a reasonably dark color. You don't want it to be too light. I'm going to apply that pretty much everywhere on the boots except in the seams and recesses as sort of a first highlight color. I'm then going to add a second highlight color by mixing in a bit more of the German gray and also a little bit of the Boneyard light. Not too much because we don't want a really light gray, but we definitely want more of a sort of a medium to lighter gray. And I'm going to put that on places like his heels and his toes, the sides of his feet, build that up a little bit. You can even add another layer with even more of the Boneyard in it to get it further lightened, but you shouldn't go too extreme here because we want these to look like sort of worn down, not very shiny combat boots, so no excessive shininess here. At this point, you could choose to just stop with the boots and just leave them sort of as kind of brown, black, gray army boots, because that did happen. But what you also see, particularly in this theater of operations and around this period, was the use of something called jungle boots, which have sort of, I guess, sort of a canvas or fabric upper part to them, and I assume this is so that the feet can breathe better, and it helps prevent various nasty foot infections and things that you can get from having wet feet and walking around in leather boots in the jungle. And it's not really clear from the sculpting on these particular boots whether they're supposed to be jungle boots or not, but I thought I would make them that anyway because I think it looks cool. It's kind of a neat detail. So what I'm doing here is I'm applying a base coat of the Russian uniform World War II again. As you can see, I'm sort of applying it to the upper part of the boot, sort of the upper part where it goes around the leg and sort of around at the front, and not where the laces are. And then once I've applied the base coat, I'm going to highlight with that Vallejo khaki color I used earlier. So I'm essentially using the same colors that I used in my sort of brown equipment pouches here. But you could also go for a more green variant if you prefer. And then finally, I'm going to take the bone yarn medium and I'm going to apply it mostly as an edge highlight here, sort of to help define better where the ends of the fabric are and where the leather part of the boots begin. But I'm also going to apply it more in some areas to around the leg where I want more highlight and blend it out a little bit. As has been the case in some earlier videos, I'm now going to be painting the leather and wood areas simultaneously because the color palette is very similar. I decided in this case that I would make his knife scabbard and also his pistol holster leather. I'm not sure that they necessarily were or that they always were or what the rules for that were, but I thought it would be really nice to get at least some different color into this uniform since it's so very, very green right now, and I felt like some kind of contrast would be nice. So I've base coated those areas with German camouflage black-brown. Now the gun, his assault rifle, it has some wood areas on it, like his grip and, you know, the stock and such. And those areas I'm now base coating using bay brown shade. Once I'm done, I'm going to, as usual, take a bay brown medium and apply that as an overall highlight to the leather areas. So as you can see, I'm putting it on quite generously. I'm really gonna, you know, cover pretty much everywhere. I'm not gonna put it on too thick, but I definitely want it to really show up. Then I'm going to move on to my chestnut shade color, and I'm going to be using that as a very, very strong highlight on the wood of the gun. As you can see, I'm really putting it on heavy because I want this to look like really red wood, so I'm putting on and kind of blending it out a little bit. I'll then apply it to the leather, but then much more sparingly, just along the edges, blend it out so it stays nice and dark in the middle. Then finally, I am going to take chestnut medium, and I'm going to apply that as an edge highlight on the gun pretty strongly, just to define where it kind of meets up with the metal. And it's going to go on the leather too, but again, in a very, very sparing quantity, so just teeny tiny bits, just along the edges where I want a little bit of extra emphasis, but overall, you want the leather areas to appear darker brown than the wood on the gun. If they look the same, then you've gone too far with painting the leather. I'm also going to go back real quick and paint the handle on his knife. I just quickly took some German camouflage black-brown and ran over that, and then one highlight only of the bay brown medium. It's such a small area, you really don't need to do anything else there. And then last but not least, I'm going to be working on the metal areas on this unit. Now, I have created a base coat for the sort of steel areas here by taking some black and mixing in some Vallejo Air gunmetal. Not too much because we don't want it to look really shiny metallic, but we just want to get a little sort of indication of glitteriness, I guess, if you will, going on there. And that's going to go all over. Mainly you're going to see it here on the assault rifle, but there are a couple other areas of equipment that are metal, like a couple closures on his packs, his belt buckle, and of course the guard on his knife, and those all should be painted in this way. I'm then going to take a bit more of the gunmetal and add it into the base color I already have to get it slightly lighter, but not very much. And I'm going to use that to very carefully sort of highlight the gun in all those areas. Remember, because we're painting a modern assault rifle, it's overwhelmingly going to be black colored more than it's going to be shiny and metal looking, so don't overdo the highlighting, please, because it will look ridiculous. If you want to get a little more, if you want to spend a little more time highlighting, you can focus on that grip on the knife and also on his ammo clip, because these were changed in and out a lot. They got a lot more wear, so they tended to get lighter and shinier, and they were sort of a more lighter shade of metal than the rest of the gun. So if you want to do more highlighting, you can do that there. And I am taking just some pure gunmetal now and applying it here and there to brighten up those areas that I just discussed, and just to get that extra shininess where I feel like it. But just as I said, don't overdo it when you're painting the main body of the rifle. Okay, here is our finished soldier from a Vietnam-era long-range reconnaissance patrol. Obviously, the main focus of this whole thing was painting the tiger stripe camo, and at the beginning I wasn't sure how hard that was going to be, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. I don't think it was that difficult. The trickiest part were the kind of the fine white lines, but they don't actually, as it turns out, require that much brush control or anything. You just have to be able to make nice, thin, fine lines. So that's about having paint that's not too thick and having a nice brush with a fine point that makes that possible, and then just learning not to press too hard. But otherwise, you're basically making squiggles. And then once that's done, shading with inks or washes is a pretty easy, effective way to really get the most out of a pattern like this, and you're really not putting in nearly as much effort to do so as you might with a more traditional sort of highlighting method like I have used on some earlier patterns. So if you enjoyed this video, please do like it, share it with your friends, leave me comments about what you thought, things you want to see in the future, of course, are always welcome as well, and do subscribe if you haven't already, because you obviously want to keep up with my latest videos and see what's coming next, and subscribing is the very best way to do that. So I guess I will see you next time, and until then, happy painting.